Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Millette with an AP World History PowerPoint presentation. This presentation will cover World War I, and here are some of our learning objectives for this particular presentation. One, explain how internal and external factors contributed to change in various states after 1900. Two, explain the causes and consequences of World War I. And three, explain how governments used a variety of methods to conduct war. In order to set the historical context for the global political landscape at the year 1900, we must look at some of the historical trends that preceded the turn of the century. It was between 1750 and 1900 when Western European states came to dominate the global political order. The imperialism practiced by Western and Westernized states in the latter part of the 19th century propelled those states to dominate the rest, having industrialized, militarized, and imperialized Western states such as England, Germany, and France, and Westernized states, such as the United States and Japan, secured their economic, territorial, and military strategic interests in the more vulnerable parts of the world. Those vulnerable parts of the world included places like Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. With that said, that vulnerability to Western and Westernized imperialism was not always present in many of those places. Recall, the rich tradition of political and economic dominance on a regional and multi-regional basis had been present in parts of Asia and Africa throughout pre-modern and modern world history. The land-based empires that were established around and after 1450 were powerful entities throughout a lot of modern world history. The mighty gunpowder empires like the Mughal, Ottoman, and Safavid empires controlled their economic and political affairs in their respective regions. They flexed their political and economic sovereignty, along with their Islamic identities, during a time of great challenge from the Christian European maritime-based empires by the likes of the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and English. The Qing dynasty of China had kept European maritime empires at bay, literally throughout the 1700s, by limiting their political, cultural, and economic interactions to a few select ports in the southern portion of China. Additionally, the Songhai Empire of West Africa came to dominate the politics and economics of the region for more than a century at the beginning of the early modern period in world history. Although by 1750, the European maritime empires had definitely established their presence in and near many of those land-based empires, the political and economic sovereignty for many of those land-based empires was still intact. So how did those once mighty land-based empires of the early modern period become so vulnerable after 1750? The answers lie in their lack of industrialization, their void in the mechanization of their military weaponry and advancement, in their naval developments, their inability to retain their control over the multiple ethnicities they once dominated, and most significantly, their inability to successfully defend themselves from the imperialism of Western and Westernized maritime-based empires of the 20th century. In essence, the land-based empires were in decline in this new global political order, and the West dominated this new political order at the start of the 20th century. In fact, the older land-based Ottoman Empire, known as the Sick Man of Europe, the Qing dynasty of China, known as the Sick Man of Asia, and the Romanov dynasty of the large Russian Empire would all collapse early in the 20th century due to a combination of internal and external factors. Internally, the nationalism of Egyptians, Arabs, Serbs, Greeks, and Armenians had proven too great for the Ottoman Turkish Empire to retain their multi-ethnic empire by the early part of the 20th century. Additionally, the Turks' inability to keep the pace with the Western powers of England and France yielded increased presence of Western nations in the Middle East and North Africa on the watch of the dilapidating Ottoman Empire. As the external forces of Western imperialism increased in intensity. Unfortunately for the Ottoman Empire, they wound up on the losing side of World War I, and their fate would be left to the victors, which oversaw the empire's dissolution. The once mighty Qing dynasty in China had also become a victim of both internal and external forces that were beyond their control, stemming from their inability to defend themselves during the Opium Wars of the early 19th century. They continued to become a target of Western imperialism. Ultimately, the spheres of influence that the Western and Westernized imperialist powers carved out of China's territory resulted in a weakened and often puppeteered Qing dynasty. Internally, the Qing dynasty struggled to maintain political and social stability, as well as economic prosperity. From their inability to solely put down the Great Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century, in that it was the British military that actually put down the rebellion, to their desperate attempt to support the rebels in the Boxer Rebellion against the Western and Westernized imperialists, it was clear to see that China's internal struggles were just as grave as their external struggles. Ultimately, a nationalist uprising in 1911 targeted the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. Succeeding in that endeavor, the new Chinese nationalist government put to rest more than 2.5 centuries of Qing dynastic rule and more than 3.5 millennia of Chinese dynastic tradition. Lastly, the large Russian Empire, governed by the Romanov dynasty since the early 17th century, met its match with both external and internal struggles. The Romanovs were exposed in their military backwardness as early as the 1850s during the Crimean War. Having lost to the Ottoman Empire, who had aligned with the more advanced militaries of France and England, the Romanov desire for territorial expansion was halted. Their guns were subpar and their military vehicles were non-existent during the Crimean War. This exposure challenged the Romanov czars to begin a state-sponsored system of industrialization. Late to the race and slow off the blocks, the top-down reforms made by the Romanov czars did very little to industrialize Russia, mechanize its military, and lift the quality of life of its working class by 1900. The economically and politically backward Russia found itself in the crosshairs of enemy German automatic weapons early in the First World War, and their military inadequacy was exposed once again. Internally, the Russian working class, both agrarian peasantry and industrial proletariat alike, had grown tired of the Romanov political system, economic system, and the destructive First World War. Ultimately, the internal and external pressures became too much for the Romanovs, as losses on the World War I battlefields and new revolutionary challenges from those influenced by the ideology of communism saw the end of the Romanov dynasty before the Great War's end. In so many ways, by 1900, the existing global political order had become one characterized by Western and Westernized imperial dominance. In great correlation, the global economic order had become one characterized by the great reach of industrial capitalism, a force that empowered the developed world, but in many ways hindered the underdeveloped world. Socially, hierarchy and class division persisted, and the global social order had become one of unequal distribution of wealth, land, and resources. Even in places that had recently achieved political independence in the 19th century, found themselves as targets of Western and westernized imperialism. They found themselves an economically underdeveloped and deprived victim of global capitalism's vicious system. And they identified themselves as a global subcaste of peasants and proletarians forced into servitude to their bourgeois exploiters. No other region of the world felt this harsh reality quite like Latin America. Latin America had a long, early modern history of being a region directly colonized and culturally altered by the powerful European maritime-based empires between 1450 and 1750. More specifically, the Portuguese and Spanish maritime empires transplanted their people and lifeways, and in many ways erased the peoples and lifeways of Native American societies. Those maritime empires extracted resources and cash crops and fully exploited the land and labor of Latin America in the initial rise of the West. However, that colonial status was not permanent, as many Latin American colonies had grown tired of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment, such as equality, natural rights, limited government, and the social contract, and motivated by the success of the American independence movement and the political and social gains made during the French Revolution, the Latin American colonies rose up against the Spanish and Portuguese empires. By the middle of the 1800s, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and a host of other Latin American states had achieved their political independence. Unfortunately for many of these newly politically independent Latin American states, political independence did not conflate with economic independence, nor industrial development. The industrialized and imperialistic United States and United Kingdom continued to exploit the land and resources of Latin America and its banana republics. Additionally, many Latin American political leaders seemed to cooperate with American and English economic and military policies, which ultimately kept Latin America underdeveloped and Latin Americans experiencing zero of the economic benefits of neocolonialism. Of all of the politically independent Latin American states, Mexico may have been the one who best exemplified this one-sided relationship. Its government, under the caudillo rule of Porfirio Diaz, had played into the foreign neocolonial policies set by the United States. Its economic backwardness had limited its industrial capacity and its citizens' material well-being. Its tradition of landed elites and a vast landless peasantry had mounted the tensions between these two classes. Its conservative values in retaining these traditions and more had returned in a multifaceted response by various groups of people within Mexico. By 1910, Mexican military leaders had turned on Diaz. Mexican soldiers had turned against American political, military, and economic intervention. And the Mexican citizenry had turned on any form of leadership that clamored to the traditions that had long subjugated them to a dismal life of oppression. Clearly, a new world order had been established at the onset of the 20th century. However, that new world order was not something in which all peoples in all places believed they could conform or should conform. It is in this historical context that the world's second most deadly conflict would be waged on a global scale. World War I, otherwise known as the Great War, was situated in the backdrop of the new world order of imperialism and capitalism, and also in that new order's challenges of nationalism and communism. In 1887, German communist Friedrich Engels politically described a futuristic conflict that would wear down the political, economic, and social order of the time. He wrote, 8 to 10 million soldiers will swallow each other up, and in so doing, eat all Europe more bare than any swarm of locusts. The devastation of the 30 Years' War compressed into the same space of 3 or 4 years and extending over the whole continent. Famine, sickness, want, brutalizing the army and the mass of the population. Irrevocable confusion of our artificial structure of trade, industry, and credit, ending in general bankruptcy. Collapse of the old states and their traditional statescraft, so that crowns will roll by dozens in the gutter and no one will be found to pick them up. It is absolutely impossible to predict where it will all end and who will emerge from the struggle as victor. Only one result is absolutely certain: general exhaustion and the establishment of the conditions for the final victory of the working class. What did he get right in his predictions? Eerily, the estimation of the conflict's claiming of 8 to 10 million soldiers' lives was actually quite accurate. The conflict's length of time in a space of 3 or 4 years, pretty close as well. The economic, demographic, and social strain the conflict would have on soldier and civilian life, nailed that one too. Say goodbye to the old states and statecraft? Well, Crochet, Russian Empire, Goulet Goulet, Ottoman Empire, Auf Wiedersehen, German Empire, and Auf Wiedersehen, Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Heck, Engels even predicted the economic fallout and the, quote, general bankruptcy, end quote, the conflict would cause, a glimpse to the global Great Depression to follow. More analytically, what didn't Engels get right? Well, in the first place, his prophecy did not exactly account for the real global nature of World War I. He only emphasized Europe and Europe's role in the conflict and the devastation to Europe that would be brought on by the conflict. And although Europe was the setting for most of the battles, most of the casualties, and most of the belligerents, Engels's failure to recognize the role that Asia, Africa, and the Americas played in this conflict has got to be called into question by the world historian. Lastly, his claim that the establishment of the conditions for the final victory of the working class is one more spot I feel like he is a bit off of the mark. As a Marxist, he probably understood any conflict in terms of class struggle. However, World War I was much more of an imperialistic war that pinned proletarian-like soldiers from multiple nations against each other, who were ultimately butchering each other for the benefit of their respective established governments of the day. He does not actually state that the working class is victorious, merely claims the final steps to that communist victory would be reached at the conclusion of the conflict. Interestingly enough, the conflict called on the belligerent nations' workforces to provide armaments, clothing, vehicles, and anything that could be mass-produced that was a necessity during such a conflict. The advent of total war called on the women of belligerent societies to take on the roles of working men who are now fighting in the various theaters of the global conflict. Governments pulled at the heartstrings of its citizens by utilizing nationalistic propaganda to command buy-in to their respective nations' military causes. If anything, nationalism was much more of a quality of World War I's working class than Marxism or communism ever was at the time. The exception to this would definitely be Russia and the rise of the world's first communist state. But as far as the rest of the major belligerent nations, nationalism won out convincingly. I've come up with a pretty simple way to analyze the multiple long-term causes to World War I, an acronym to help students quickly recall the main long-term causes to the war. In fact, the acronym is MAIN, M-A-I-N. The M in MAIN stands for militarism, which was the practice of a government to keep a strong and advanced military, and for that government to have a high willingness to use that advanced military against rival nations. For many governments, military budgets expanded, and their willingness to fund more mechanized weaponry, military vehicles, and naval development increased greatly. This did not just begin with the outbreak of the war in 1914, but a trend that had preceded the outbreak of the war by several decades. Perhaps the international competition spawned by the age of imperialism generated the naval arms race, the production of automatic weapons, and a large standing armies that could be deployed more quickly and thoroughly than ever before. Over the period from 1890 to 1914, no European nation spent more on its military development than Germany, the leader of the Second Industrial Revolution, the new nation that sought to surpass England in industrial and imperialistic achievement. The other belligerent nations followed Germany's military expenditure trend and exponentially increased their military budgets as well. The new mechanized weaponry also dictated the way the war would be waged. The introduction of tanks and planes brought entirely new dimensions to warfare in World War I. Though tanks were slow and a bit clunky, they were armored vehicles that were able to press through the most dangerous areas in World War I, the lands between the trenches, no man's land. Planes, although not as fast and stealthy as they would be in World War II, made air warfare significant for the first time in world history. Submarine technology was advanced by the outbreak of the war, and the devastation of naval warfare in the Atlantic Ocean during World War I was unprecedented, thanks to the difficulty in detecting such stealthy watercraft. Poison gas and flamethrowers also contributed to the brutality of the war, but no other weapon exemplified the mechanization of the military quite like the machine gun. The mounted machine gun turned virtually every soldier into a killer, and you did not have to be an expert marksman to hit your target. So M, militarism. The A in MAIN stands for alliances. The alliance system that developed prior to and during World War I dragged several European nations into belligerence. Additionally, distant colonial lands and their populations tended to align with their imperial nations during the war. Prior to World War I, all the major advanced nations of Europe were entangled into military alliances, as there was no real diplomatic governing body for all of the European nations. By the outbreak of the First World War, the two most significant alliances were the Triple Entente, which was made up by England, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, which was made up by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Those alliances did not remain stagnant throughout the duration of the war. In fact, very early in the conflict, Italy broke ties with the Triple Alliance and eventually joined the Triple Entente nations, which would be referred to as the Allied powers during the war. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire would join Germany and Austria-Hungary, which ultimately made up the wartime alliance known as the Central Powers. Eventually, even neutral nations such as Belgium and the United States would be brought into the conflict. These wartime alliances, though grounded in the failures of late 19th century European diplomacy, extended this conflict beyond the confines of Europe. African colonial soldiers fought for the French, English, and German militaries. Additionally, India, an English royal colony, sided with its imperial nation. Canadian, New Zealander, and Australian troops also served in the English military through this extensive alliance system. Even the Far East became entangled in the conflict as the Japanese Empire sided with the Allied powers in hopes to secure German Pacific Islands and German spheres of influence in China. So another main long-term cause to World War I was A, alliances. The I in Maine stands for imperialism. Imperialism, which was the practice of developed nations politically and economically dominating lesser developed nations throughout the world, dated back well beyond 1914. In fact, most of the second half of the 19th century was part of the so-called Age of Imperialism. Imperialistic rivalries between England and Germany that dated back to 1871 were still fresh by 1900 and were more intensified by 1914. The naval arms race between the two nations and the territorial disputes in Africa and the Pacific Islands mounted that tension into the first year of the war. Territorial disputes within Europe between Germany and France that dated back to 1871. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, played out on the global scene as well. German and French interests in Africa and the Far East resulted in increased imperial tensions between the two nations. In fact, World War I's theater was not just relegated to Europe. Battles took place in Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, and in the Pacific Ocean, giving this conflict a truly global reach. In many ways, the victors gained the losers' overseas territories, as many of the imperialist nations dangled promises of independence to their respective colonies for their wartime contributions. Much to the chagrin of colonial societies who did contribute to their imperialist nations' wartime causes, those were ultimately the false promises of independence and self-determination that World War I would historically become notorious for. So, the I in Maine stands for imperialism. The last letter in Maine, N, stands for nationalism. Nationalism was a political movement to either strengthen a pre-existing nation or to create a new nation. Historians claim that the nation state ultimately and definitely won out against the traditional empires of early modern world history. Nationalism became a movement that touched national populations in Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa between the early 19th century and the early 20th century. For many pre-existing nations like England and France, their movements of nationalism tended to correlate with their imperialism as they pushed their nations to both European and global heights unprecedented in their respective histories. However, nationalism was also a movement that sought to create new nations for a common group of people who had been under the oppression of foreign governments. In many ways, as much as imperialism complemented nationalism in places like England, France, and Germany by the late 19th century, imperialism also generated great movements of nationalism within oppressed societies. Nationalistic movements were present in African societies to combat European imperialism. Nationalistic movements were present in India to combat English imperialism. Nationalistic movements were present in the Philippines to combat American imperialism. Nationalistic movements were present in Indochina to combat French imperialism. And nationalistic movements were present in China to combat European, American, and Japanese imperialism. However, nationalistic tensions were greatest in the southeastern portion of Europe, in the so-called Balkans, where various groups of peoples lived under the foreign rule of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Groups like the Serbs and Croats perceived themselves as second-class citizens under foreign Austrian-Hungarian rule. The Serbs were especially aggressive against the Austrian-Hungarian presence in southeastern Europe, and even sought alliances with Austria-Hungary's enemy, Russia, in order to vie for an independent nation in the region. The tensions that mounted in southeastern Europe ultimately brought on World War I and nationalism. The end in Maine could be considered the most direct of the causes to the outbreak of the First World War. In late June of 1914, Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke and heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, had traveled from Vienna, Austria, the headquarters of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, to Sarajevo, Bosnia, a city with a large Bosnian Serb population and an aura of Serbian nationalist aspirations. Franz Ferdinand was to replace the aging 83-year-old Austrian-Hungarian Emperor Francis Joseph, who had been in power in Austria since he was 18 years old in 1848. Franz hoped to secure the Balkan region, including Bosnia and Serbia, under Austrian-Hungarian rule. In a parade in the city of Sarajevo that included the Archduke and his wife in an open car, a small group of terrorists had other ideas for the Archduke, and ultimately the relationship between the Balkan states and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. A bomb was thrown into the Archduke's car, and when it did not explode, the driver quickly turned down an alleyway in an attempt to secure the Archduke and his wife. Waiting in that alleyway was 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb and member of Young Bosnia, a nationalistic group that sought to end Austria-Hungary's rule in the Balkans. Princip, outfitted by the terrorist organization known as the Black Hand, shot the Archduke and his wife in that alleyway. Princip, who was a terminally ill victim of tuberculosis, was arrested and held in prison for 4 years until his death. This assassination of the Archduke prompted the Austrian-Hungarian military to mobilize against Serbia. In turn, Russia honored its alliance with Serbia and mobilized against Austria-Hungary. In response to Russian military mobilization, Germany honored its alliance with France. Correction on that. Germany honored its alliance with Austria-Hungary and thus mobilized against Russia. Germany became even more aggressive and ultimately declared war on France and began its invasion of France through neutral Belgium. After this act of aggression, England would declare war against Germany, and the entire alliance system had unfolded by August 4th, 1914. Under the direction of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German military moved aggressively through Belgium en route to Paris in hopes of securing a quick victory against France. The Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who devised the offensive strategy, was executed and the German military mobilized quickly through Belgium, a neutral nation. French soldiers and now deployed English soldiers took to digging trenches in the northeastern portion of France from the Swiss-French border near the Swiss Alps up to the English Channel. The trenches were dug in order to slow down the German advancement and to protect Allied soldiers. This trench warfare became the main characteristic of the Western Front of World War I, the battlefront with the greatest numbers of casualties in the entire conflict. Trench warfare had terrible effects on soldiers' lives, The trenches and the bunkers were unsanitary and were oftentimes flooded with rainwater and infested with rats. Soldiers suffered from physical and mental ailments in the trenches. For example, trench foot was a condition of soldiers' feet that had become infected from the faulty boots, rainwater, lacerations, and untreated wounds led to painful and unsightly feet that in many occasions resulted in amputation and sometimes even death. Shell shock became a mental condition experienced by soldiers who had been exposed to the anxiety and loud noises of trench warfare sustained over an elongated period of time. Shell shock stayed with soldiers permanently in their return home after the war's conclusion. The German goal of a swift defeat of France would not be achieved due to the stalemate caused by the use of trench warfare in the Western Front. In the Western Front, the war turned into an elongated war of attrition, as few decisive battles were fought, and the victor would really just be the nation or nations that could continue to fight the longest, rather than the nation or nations that could win the most battles. For example, the battles of the Marne River, the Battle of Fort Verdun, and the Battle of the Somme River were all battles in the Western Front that ended with extremely high numbers of soldier casualties, but with very little territorial gain for either side of the war. War in the Western Front dragged on until November of 1918, which was much to the dismay of the Kaiser's war strategy. In the Eastern Front, the war was played out quite differently. Russia's military, though large in size, but under-equipped and far less advanced, fared well against the Austrian-Hungarian military. However, Russia's military was no match for Germany's more advanced military, and that was exposed very early in the conflict. Russia never secured a victory against Germany in the Eastern Front, and as Russian soldiers were captured, killed, defeated, and deflated, the Russian home front was also experiencing the defeat and the deflation. In 1917, in a courageous act to rally the Russian military and the Russian people, Tsar Nicholas II left his capital of St. Petersburg to lead an offensive against the German military. In his absence, the first of two revolutions that year were staged. The first, known as the February-March Revolution, saw the members of the Duma, Russia's representative governmental body that had been established in 1905, declare itself the provisional government of a transitioning Russia. At the front, the Tsar, unsuccessful in his charge against the Germans, retreated and returned to St. Petersburg to find the revolution in action. Nicholas abdicated his throne, and the provisional government took control of the Russian political system. As 1917 continued, the provisional government's failure to make peace with Germany, along with its continued demands of the Russian workers to produce and the Russian soldiers to fight, the provisional government fell out of favor with the Russian people, especially a group of Russian communists known as the Bolsheviks, living within St. Petersburg. Smuggled back into St. Petersburg was the Bolshevik leader, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's return prompted the October Revolution in 1917, which saw the overthrow of the provisional government and the rise of the Bolsheviks to power. The Bolshevik government was the first successful communist revolution in world history, and its party's rule would be retained throughout most of the remainder of the 20th century, as it led Russia's new identity, the Soviet Union. Lenin vied for peace with Germany and had fundamental philosophical disagreements with World War I. As a communist, Lenin saw the war as an imperialistic conflict that pinned the world's workers against each other for the benefit of their imperial and bourgeois masters. To Lenin, World War I was wrong. It was the wrong conflict, as he saw the righteous conflict to be one of class struggle between the world's workers and the established political and economic elites. In the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, Lenin surrendered to Germany. Russia fell into a 3-year civil war, which Lenin and the Bolsheviks successfully defended their reign against an international coalition of anti-communists in order to secure their position as the leadership of the newly formed Soviet Union. Belligerent governments utilized numerous methods in order to conduct the First World War. The First World War, as mentioned previously, was the first total war of the 20th century. Total war is a type of warfare in which entire societies, soldier and civilian alike, are involved in and targeted by the conflict. High soldier and civilian casualties characterize total war as well. Therefore, the belligerent governments needed numerous methods in order to conduct a war of such great magnitude. First and foremost, belligerent governments utilized available media such as printed publications, visual arts, and speeches to keep the civilian population supportive of the war effort. Propaganda in print form was characterized by xenophobia, racism, and intense nationalism in order to rally public support for the war effort. Civilians were moved to donate food and clothing, purchase war bonds, or join military regiments on a voluntary basis in the time before military conscription was put into action through the use of print media in the form of governmental propaganda. Belligerent governments suspended freedoms of speech, expression, and press in order to censor conscientious objectors and others who demonstrated against the war. Civilian populations were mobilized in the home countries for the greater purpose of waging war. As the conflict intensified, belligerent governments began conscripting male civilians into the militaries. Women of the home countries were also expected to do their part, and in many instances, women flocked to the armaments factories to produce armaments necessary to conduct war. In the colonies, colonial soldiers were also utilized to conduct war. In India, Indian soldiers were utilized by the British military in order to invade the Ottoman Empire. Those Indian colonial soldiers were extremely helpful in England's victory over the Ottoman Empire after a long and disastrous naval conflict at Gallipoli in the Black Sea. The Germans, as well as the English and the French, mobilized large numbers of African colonial soldiers in order to wage war. Many African colonial soldiers were brought to the Western Front and predominantly performed manual labor for the Allied powers. In the military campaigns in Africa, few African colonial soldiers were even allowed to carry guns, and in most cases they were used as porters and manual laborers in those African campaigns. The use of African colonial soldiers in World War I was a testament to the continued existence of social Darwinism and its application to people of color. Consider this: the fact that the English and French officers did not allow African soldiers to shoot at German soldiers serves as a testament to the notion that social Darwinism and its inherent racism was even greater than the forces of the nationalistic tensions between English and French and their German enemies. Belligerent governments also took control of the economy and in many ways suspended the practice of laissez-faire capitalism. Instead, they established wartime industries boards in order to regulate the economy in favor of the war effort. Resources such as steel, iron, and petroleum were prioritized for the production of war materiel. Consumer products were of secondary concern. So therefore, belligerent governments severely restricted the use of vital resources for the production of consumer products. Civilian populations were expected to consume goods and resources modestly and were subjected to food rations in order to ensure food and resources were in abundance for the war effort. The wartime economies of the belligerent nations fueled the war effort and in many ways challenged the economic order of things as the practices of capitalism were halted during the war. However, the most grotesque aspect of total war in World War I was the intentional victimizing of civilian populations. No other event exemplifies the brutality of total war like the Armenian genocide during World War I. Perpetrated by the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the Armenian genocide claimed the lives of more than 1.5 million Armenians living as ethnic and religious minorities within the Ottoman Empire. Armenians were a Christian group of people who had their own homeland, their own language, and their own history of struggle, living as a minority within the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans saw them as a threat to their governance and economic well-being, and ultimately the Ottoman government began to target the various Armenian communities in Southwest Asia. Through forced deportations, firing squads, and death marches through the Syrian desert, Armenian civilians suffered at the hands of Ottoman Turkish policies. In this instance, total war gave opportunity to a government that had too much power and had been fueled by too much ethnic, racial, and religious nationalism, and had very little resistance to commit such a grotesque crime against an entire group of people. (1917) and 1918 were the final 2 years of the war, and in those final 2 years, the elongated war of attrition finally started to turn toward the war's end. In 1917, the United States broke its neutrality and declared war against Germany. German and American relations had been tense throughout most of the war in spite of American neutrality. The United States provided war material to the English, which was in turn used to equip English soldiers who were ultimately deployed to the Western Front in France in order to kill German soldiers. The German government knew that every commercial ship sailing from the United States across the Atlantic Ocean heading for England could potentially be carrying war material that could be used against German soldiers. The Kaiser strategically placed his U-boats throughout the Atlantic in order to stop both naval and commercial vessels from traversing the ocean. In 1915, a German U-boat fired on a British ship called the Lusitania, a sister ship to the Titanic and the Britannica, all massive ships that were deemed indestructible by their creators. The Lusitania succumbed to German U-boats' torpedo blasts and ultimately sank in the Atlantic Ocean. English, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh passengers all drowned due to the sinking of the Lusitania. On board the Lusitania were more than 200 American civilians, and although the United States Congress did not immediately declare war, President Woodrow Wilson and the American Navy began to employ naval convoys to protect commercial vessels sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1917, a German telegraph communication was intercepted in Washington, D.C. by British agents who had been wiretapping German telegraph transmissions throughout the war. In this particular instance, the communication was to be sent from Berlin to Mexico City. Referred to as the Zimmermann Note, after the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, the telegraph was intended to reach the revolutionary government in Mexico. The purpose of the note to the government in Mexico was to entice the Mexican government into an alliance with Germany by involving themselves in a military conflict against the United States. The goal would have been to shift American naval presence away from the Atlantic Ocean and into the Gulf of Mexico. Additionally, in the Zimmermann Note, it was made evident that Germany would commence with unrestricted U-boat warfare against any and all naval and commercial vessels in the Atlantic Ocean, which would have included American naval vessels at the time. This discovery of the Zimmermann Note prompted President Wilson and the U.S. Congress to declare war against Germany, and over the course of the final 18 months of the war, in the Western Front, the United States deployed more than 1 million soldiers to France to fight against the Germans. The so-called American Expeditionary Force, headed by American General John J. Pershing, was too much for the Germans to overcome. That by November of 1918, the war's conclusion was near. So, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the Allied powers and Germany agreed to an armistice or ceasefire. Telegraph communications got the word out to the towns and cities, and ultimately to the soldiers in the Western Front, and the war came to its conclusion. Throughout the following year, 1919, the city of Paris played host to the leadership of the remaining Allied powers in the Paris Peace Conference. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, along with the American President Woodrow Wilson and a host of other representatives from the Allied nations, convened in Paris in order to create the terms of a treaty with the defeated nation of Germany. Immediately, it was clear to the representatives present at the Paris Peace Conference that Clemenceau sought to punish and brutalize Germany for their acts of aggression in the war. France's countryside was torn apart by the German invasion, and its agricultural and industrial productivity was practically ended for 4 years due to brutal German occupation of northeastern France. France would have to undergo a great physical reconstruction, as well as a great economic recovery now that the war was over. Clemenceau intended for Germany to pay for everything that France needed to reconstruct and recover, and that sentiment would be carried into the terms of the treaty. President Wilson, who was the first sitting American president to travel abroad, did not carry the same animosity for the defeated Germans as Clemenceau carried. However, Wilson introduced his 14 points at the Paris Peace Conference, where he made a case for the self-determination of subject peoples and their necessity to govern themselves. Self-determination would only be actualized to subject peoples within Europe, as the terms of the treaty created several new nations in the wake of the defeat of Germany and the rest of the Central Powers. Additionally, Wilson called for a global political body that would include nations that would be dedicated to maintaining the peace and security of Europe and the world. A global political body that would renounce war as an option in solving political, territorial, and military problems between nations. He called this global political body the League of Nations, and that too would find its way into the final terms of the treaty. Ultimately, the treaty that was being constructed became known as the Treaty of Versailles, as it was finalized and agreed to by its contributors in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, just outside the city of Paris. In the final terms of the Treaty of Versailles included the War Guilt Clause, in which Germany was blamed for the instigation and destruction of the war. Additionally, Germany was saddled with a $32 billion war reparations debt, in which they were expected to pay in full to the English and French governments. Furthermore, Germany was forced to reduce the size of its military, including its navy and its army. Along with that, the disputed territories of Alsace and Lorraine were to be returned to France, and other European lands were stripped from German control and utilized to create new nations in Central and Eastern Europe. Additionally, Germany was forced to give up all of its overseas possessions in Africa, the Far East, and the islands in the South Pacific. The Kaiser was forced to abdicate his throne, and Germany was mandated to create a republic form of government in the wake of the Kaiser's abdication and exile. The League of Nations was established, and England and France became the major players in this new global political body. And although the League of Nations was an American idea, presented by an American president. It was the presence of the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles that caused the U.S. Senate to decide not to ratify the treaty. American senators had decided that the United States needed to isolate itself from Europe's military and political issues so as to not become entangled in a war of such magnitude ever again. From 1919 forward, the United States entered a 20-year period of isolationism and would not take part in any of the League's initiatives throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The conclusion of World War I brought great changes to the world. It resulted in the collapse of four major world empires, including the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. Germany, again, was forced to give up all of its overseas colonies, as well as a lot of its European territory. Former German territory in Eastern Europe was granted to the newly formed nation of Poland. Austria and Hungary were forced to split apart, and new republics were formed in the wake of the Habsburg family's abdication and exile from Austria. The dissolution of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire also gave rise to the new nations of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire was forced to dissolve through additional treaties by 1922, and in its wake, the new nation of Turkey would be established. Arab populations in places such as Iraq, Palestine, and Syria all came under the League of Nations mandate system. In essence, the French and the British came to control these Arab territories for their own economic and political gains as they convinced themselves and the rest of the world that Arab populations were not quite ready for self-determination. And of course, the Russian Empire was no more, as it had succumbed to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and was solidifying itself as the leader of the communist world in its new identity as the Soviet Union. As much as empires collapsed after World War I, some empires grew. For example, England retained all of its colonies in India and Africa, its spheres of influence in China, and even gained its mandates in former Ottoman territory, specifically in Iraq and Palestine. France retained its colonies in Southeast Asia and its spheres of influence in China. It also gained mandates over former Ottoman territory in Lebanon and Syria. As well, both England and France gained former German colonies in Africa. Lastly, the Japanese Empire expanded after the conclusion of World War I. Japan solidified its control over its spheres of influence in China and even forced the Chinese nationalist government to comply Japan's 21 demands, which increased Japanese economic and military presence in mainland China. Additionally, Japan also took over former German spheres of influence in China and also took over former German islands in the South Pacific, increasing Japanese naval presence throughout the region. The expansion of these imperialistic nations fueled the fire of nationalism and self-determination in places that were denied their own nations and governments. For example, the League mandate system in Southwest Asia intensified Arab nationalism and Arab desire to construct their own nations and governments. Additionally, British control over the Mandate of Palestine fueled the movement of Zionism, otherwise known as Jewish nationalism. England's continued rule over India and the rest of South Asia intensified Indian nationalism and their desire to free themselves from England's imperialism. In French Indochina, in Southeast Asia, Vietnamese nationalism intensified as they were denied independence at the Paris Peace Conference. African nationalism also intensified as the false promises of independence and self-determination were realized on the African peoples after the conclusion of World War I. Additionally, Chinese nationalism continued to intensify, especially against the Japanese, as the Chinese government's political and economic sovereignty continued to be challenged by the presence of so many foreign governments in China. Also, the international ideology of communism was given life after World War I. Of course, in Russia, a communist party came to power. And with the conclusion of the Russian Civil War by 1922, the Russian Communist Party solidified its control. The relative success of the Russian Communist Party spawned groups of people in other nations to follow suit. Communism became an alternative to the imperialistic and nationalistic forces of oppression, as it championed working class people and a complete transition from traditional and conservative forms of government. By the early 1920s, the Chinese Communist Party would be created by its founder, Mao Zedong. And over the course of the next 30 years, Mao and his Communist Party and Red Army would do battle with Chinese nationalists in order to secure the world's second communist-led nation before mid-century. Ultimately, World War I showcased the existence of the imperialistic world order that had been created prior to 1900. However, the Great War also demonstrated the great challenges to that imperialistic world order with the intensification of nationalism and communism, especially in the years after the war's conclusion. Interestingly, World War I's beginnings were characterized by positivity and a relative eagerness for war. However, by the war's end, it was anything but glorious. The war had certainly taken its toll on the political systems, national economies, soldier and civilian populations, and the demographics of the belligerent societies. World War I created an age of disillusionment and post-war pessimism that would be captured by the so-called lost generation of European and American writers. The lost generation criticized war and the governmental role in total war and placed blame on the political systems of the day. Would the world heed the words of the lost generation? Could it cooperate through the League of Nations? Could it quell the aggressive forces of imperialism, nationalism, and communism? Or would this world be doomed to duplicate the atrocities of total war once again?